Yes, what ends up happening is that many of these authors that don't fit the mold of the big companies publish in very small companies, and so those companies are very interesting, and you have access to them. Thanks to globalization, I have access to small presses from Mexico, from Brazil, from Ecuador, from Colombia, of course. But the thing is, if you don't deconstruct that narrative, if you don't think about it critically, you think that the best authors always publish in the big publishing houses and they win prizes and they are very well recognized, etc. While the ones that publish in small publishing houses with small printing amounts of books, etc., you consider them probably not very good writers. That's kind of the perception that people have, and you really need to think about it in a much more complex way. My name is Norman Valencia. I am a professor of Spanish and Portuguese at the Claremont Colleges. I am originally from Colombia, so Spanish is my native language. But I love Brazilian culture and I loved learning Portuguese. So here at the colleges, I teach Portuguese classes, and I also try to teach courses where we talk about Latin America as a whole, because it often happens that Brazil is left out because it has another language. And so we have a sort of a division between Spanish-speaking Latin America and Brazil. But Brazil is an enormous country and it has a wonderful, interesting culture that many Latin Americans actually love. So in my classes, I try to create bridges between the Spanish-speaking America and Brazil. I also teach classes on Brazilian literature and culture. Yeah, I think that's it. One thing that I really find interesting is that Brazil has a really unique history as opposed or as compared to other Latin American countries. For example, throughout the 19th century, Brazil was a monarchy. It had a king. The Portuguese crown traveled from Portugal to Brazil, and Rio de Janeiro became the courtly city where the king was established, and kind of Brazil became the center of an important European empire. That is very strange in terms of Latin America, and to me, creating comparative approaches between the Spanish-speaking countries that are trying to create republics and are considering centralist or federalist governments, democracy, or other possible options compared to a monarchy, I always learn a lot about other Latin American countries by seeing the Brazilian situation that is so unique and it had such different consequences that I learn about, for example, myself. I learn about Colombia. So one exercise I do in a class is the final paper for my Brazilian literature and culture class is I ask my students to make comparisons between Brazil and their own culture. So many will make comparisons between the US and Brazil. Others come from different places, so they make comparisons between Mexico and Brazil, Puerto Rico and Brazil, India and Brazil. I've had papers on that. I had a wonderful paper on Hawaii and Brazil, because Hawaii has a very interesting musical culture of protest that could be compared to many issues in Brazilian music. And so, because Brazil is so unique, it has taught me about myself, my own culture, and I try to engage my students in that way. And I think that's fascinating, and that forms my research and my teaching. It was very fruitful to me to think about Colombia and Brazil comparatively. It taught me a lot about who I am and about how Colombians see the world. They are very different outlooks. I think that imperial era created a country that was very divided, very complex, but that maintained a certain unity and a certain pride and a sense of we have been the center of an empire. We have been the center of a very important nation in the world. My Colombia didn't have that. It has more of a history of failed efforts of unity, of being perceived very negatively in the world, while Brazil is often perceived very positively in the world. And just taking your time to understand Brazilian history, Brazilian culture, the way it reflects the many stages that it went through, just taught me that, well, because Colombia is so different, it also has a different outlook, right? So there is a distinctly Colombian outlook and a distinctly Brazilian outlook that emerges from its history. And they are very different, and I learned about how I look at the world by trying to understand Brazilians and how differently they look at their history, their world, their culture. It was fascinating, and I tried to bring that to the class. So throughout different texts, I tried to tell my students, do you see some similarities and differences? Let's try to enunciate a little bit of some of the similarities or differences. So for example, there's a Pocahontas type of text in the Brazilian tradition called Iracema, a Portuguese conqueror and an indigenous woman, and they fall in love. What does that mean? What is it trying to say? What was Pocahontas trying to say in the US? So we do these small exercises throughout the semester, and at the end, I talk to my students about their projects and how they can make those comparisons, the kind of research they can do. And they have to teach me, because I admit I am not an expert in US culture, for example, or Puerto Rican or Mexican, so I learned a ton from them. Wow. That paper on Hawaii was fascinating, and I learned a lot. So yeah, probably my first contact with Brazilian culture was soccer. And in 1982, I saw the World Cup where Brazil had a wonderful team, and they lost, and it was a very sad moment in my life. But soccer is a perfect example of how Brazil is perceived in a certain way, and a way that, as you say very well, needs to be deconstructed to some extent. Soccer in Brazil is often perceived as, first of all, a very harmonious, beautiful form of game that is the product of the fact that Brazil has created a certain harmony, for example, between the races. Brazil has a certain mythology that could be maybe summarized in a brief sentence that they use, which is racial democracy. They have this idea that because historically races have often mixed from colonization to the present, that the country is a racial democracy. And that the great cultural products of the country come from that racial democracy. So for example, soccer is great because it manages to unite people from different parts of the country, people of different races, Afro-Brazilians and European immigrants to Brazil. And so that is the origin of one of the great cultural expressions of Brazil. The truth of the matter is, if you study the history, you're going to see a lot of conflict, for sure. A lot of racial conflict, a lot of discrimination. Very different from the US. I think the US was mostly a segregationist country. Brazil has certainly different forms of racial integration, but that racial integration does not end conflict, and it does not end discrimination. And so it's very interesting to see the perception of the beautiful game, the jogo bonito, as an expression of racial harmony to some extent. But if you study soccer, you're going to see discrimination, you're going to see conflict, you're going to see today corruption, for example. And so that deconstruction of the image of Brazil is fascinating, and it's one of the great aspects, I think, of studying Brazil. I think I have two projects that are connected. One of them is the idea that neoliberalism is something that shapes the way literature is produced, the way authors write, the main topics that they deal with is very much linked to neoliberalism. The problem is that neoliberalism is often presented as a very economic aspect, and so how do you relate this kind of dry economic theory to culture? How does that translate into culture? And for some people, they're kind of separate. But I feel that neoliberalism has a cultural aspect that we need to think about more. Neoliberalism creates a certain worldview. It creates an ethics. It creates ideas about writing. The other element that I think is connected and that I find fascinating is new media. New media is definitely linked to neoliberalism, to economic projects. Most of the new media are corporations, but they also transform the way we read, the way we write, the way we perceive literature, the way we interact with authors. I follow authors on Twitter, and so I know what they're doing in a very different way from the past, when my only interaction was probably their books and their interviews, right? Right now I have a constant way of knowing about authors. And so these are elements that completely transform literature, culture, etc. And I am trying to think about that and to create a project with that. And I think it's distinctly different from 20th century literature, and that there's something new there, I think, that I'm trying to explore. I mean, if you study contemporary Latin American literature, you can see that there are many filters that determine what is a popular Latin American author and what isn't. And they are determined definitely by publishing houses, for example, in Latin America, one of the best ways to become a famous author is to win a prize, a famous literary prize. Those literary prizes are owned by those big companies. So they determine who wins the prize. And in general, I mean, it is almost partially known that this is not a true contest, that they know who is going to win because this is a person that represents certain ideas that the company, that the publishing house considers popular, considers that they're going to sell well. And so it is a way of just creating a publicity kind of stunt to promote this author from the start, but they select authors that they believe will fit a certain marketing trend, for example. And so economics is completely immersed in culture right now, and that creates a very unique way to look at literature. So I've had to learn about economics. I've had to learn about publishing. I've had to learn a lot about history. These are elements that are absolutely necessary to think about literature. So it's not only just trying to read a text and see, okay, it's very interesting. Everything that surrounds it, historically, politically, economically, is very important. I think that if you start thinking about neoliberalism as a creator of an ethics, a worldview, at some point you're just immersed in it. It's very difficult to challenge it. So for many young authors, their dream is just to publish in those publishing houses, and they do whatever it takes. And there's kind of a route to do that. For example, right now, trying to live in Europe, trying to live in Spain, near those publishing presses, working with them, living in Madrid, in Barcelona, that's the hubs for publishing. So that's some of the things that young authors will do. So many of them are aware of this. I mean, it's not that they are not aware. They if you see interviews, they're going to be critical about them. But they know that if they want to sell their books and to be important and famous, etc., they play the game. They play the game. It is what it is, and they sort of play the game. There are very few authors that challenge this model, and some of them are authors that have already made it. And so they have this kind of position of power where they can decide whatever they want. There's a famous Argentinian author called César Aira. He publishes very brief novels, almost 2 a year, 3 a year. Whoa. And he decides this novel goes to a big publishing house, this novel goes to this little local publishing house. I'm just going to give it away. I don't care. But he's someone with a lot of power in the world of culture, so he can do that. He has the privilege to do that. One of the books I published is on Tomás González, a Colombian author. And he, to me, is the best Colombian author in the last 20, 30 years. But his books, he began publishing in the 1980s. And essentially, he became a well-known author in 2011, more or less, when he managed to publish a bestseller in a big publishing company. But he's very unwilling to do this. He doesn't have social media. He's very quiet. He doesn't do interviews. His interviews are kind of terrible. So you have a sense that he's not interested in that and that he's trying to challenge that kind of model. His first book was published by a bar in Bogota. He worked as a barman. Whoa. And they knew that he wrote, and the owner said, like, you know what? I'm going to publish your book. Ooh. And so a first novel that is published by a bar, yeah. It's kind of a fascinating story, and now today it is a classic in Colombian literature. But I find it fascinating that he's to some extent challenging the model, but it's been very difficult for him to become a very well-recognized author, to the extent that I believe my book, the book that I edited, it's an edited volume. It is the first edited volume on the work on this author. Wow. So I think he's a really important author, and he began publishing in the 1980s, and only in 2020 you have a book after he has published almost 18 books. Wow. It's the first time that there is a critical book that addresses most of his work and addresses the history of his publications and shows that he's a very important, very consistent author in Colombian history. So authors that don't work in that mold, they have a lot of challenges. It's very difficult for them. Yeah. So I have a project that I really love in terms of translation, which is I began a very amateurish translation of Dante when I was around 23 years old. Wow. With friends in college. So we took a Dante class, and we were very excited. We had a great professor, but Dante is an author where every single word seems to have a perfect meaning. And so if a translation is wrong, you produce a wrong reading. Yeah. And so for us, it was catastrophic to find a mistake in translation. It was like devastating. Like our interpretation of this almost perfect text could be destroyed by a wrong translation. That's the way I perceived it when I was young and when I was in school. My trajectory as an academic scholar is, first of all, that there is no perfect text and that there is no perfection that you need to preserve. There is your point of view. I have a point of view about a text, and in translation, I also come with a point of view. Yeah. And so my point of view in terms of Dante, I'm still working with one colleague who is also an academic and a translator of Portuguese texts, Jerónimo Pizarro. And we work with another colleague who is now a Danteist, an expert in Dante, Humberto Ballesteros. So he writes short essays and footnotes, and Jerónimo and I work on the translation. And our image of translation has shifted completely. Right now, what we want is, people are often afraid about Dante because of this image of perfection. And we want to create a translation that is easy to read, easy to understand, facilitates Dante, and makes him your contemporary, makes him someone that you can engage with in a freer way. And so it changed. So definitely the image of translation I have changed, and now I want to be kind of a facilitator. This is a wonderful text. Yeah. This is a text that is really enjoyable. But if you come to it with an excessive respect, oh, it's difficult, it has references that I would never understand, something like that, then you're never going to enjoy it. Yeah. So we want to make it as enjoyable as possible. It's translated from Italian to Spanish. Italian was kind of the first language I started to learn, and also I had to learn Latin in college, and Dante's Italian is deeply influenced by Latin, so some of my knowledge of Latin was also useful for translation. But my objective now is to make Dante understandable, enjoyable, that people can focus on the more enjoyable parts of it, which are really fascinating and I love. But also the idea that if you manage to engage Dante in a more friendly way, in a more open way, without the fear of, oh, this is a cultural monument and I would never. No, Dante is exciting. Dante is fun. Dante uses horrible words. Dante uses words that I would not use in front of my mom. Because his personality is just very interesting, and so I want other people to enjoy that. There's another very famous Latin American author, Jorge Luis Borges. He was a great reader of Dante, and he also tried to do that. He tried to say, you know what? And Borges is also a very intellectual, philosophical author, and people are also very afraid of him. But he's like, no, we should read Dante as a friend. Like, it's short texts. Italian and Spanish are very close together. They're very close to each other. We should just engage with Dante. And he said Dante was one of the great joys of life. Wow. And that we shouldn't forbid ourselves of enjoying one of the great joys of life. Yeah. So our translation tries to honor that idea, to make Dante as enjoyable as possible for a reader.